in the field someday. So with that being said, I've done this class or this presentation, I think 3 or 4 times. And when I first got the list of what I was supposed to talk about, I was like, wow, we're going to talk really fast because there's a lot of stuff on the list. So we're going to give it its best shot. If you could hold your questions to the end, that would be, it makes the whole thing flow a little bit faster. So with that being said, let me share my screen. And we're basically going to have an introduction to the Sonoran Desert. It's the desert you see in your backyard, every time you go out. And it's a really amazing place. And that's just a little bit about what we're going to talk about because we're going to cover a lot of ground. So if you have a helmet, it might be a good time to strap it on because here we go. So this is from the National Park Service. The Sonoran Desert and the areas around it are actually quite complex, both geologically and biologically. And it doesn't really matter, in my opinion, whether you're interested in plants or maybe just cacti and succulents, or maybe birds or mammals or reptiles or insects. We live in one of the most biodiverse regions in the country, especially when you consider we don't have a coast near us. A lot of these states that have a high diversity get the benefits of having, marine mammals show up once in a while, or birds that are mostly marine show up. So we're actually in a really interesting spot. And when I moved here, my wife and I moved here in 1998, it felt a lot like I was moving to Disneyland from a biological perspective because it's just so fantastic. So as you can see, Phoenix and Maricopa County are in the Sonoran Desert ecoregion. The green, the pale green there on the outskirts is the Apache Highlands ecoregion. And both of those figure prominently in, what we're going to talk about tonight. Now, with that being said, this is just one interpretation of these regions. You could probably go online and find 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 more. This is just the one I use. And we as a species, we like things in black and white. It's this or it's that. This happened and this was the result. Nature is not a big fan of black and white. Nature really likes an infinite variety of grays. And so these things all kind of blend together. It's not like you take one step and you go from the Sonoran Desert ecoregion into the Apache Highland ecoregion. It doesn't work that way. But this will give you a broader, from space scale of what's around us. And as you go north in the state or northwest, you get different ecoregions that have different geology, different climates, and things like that. So we live in a really cool state for many reasons. This looks like a map that a bunch of kindergartners spilled their paint on. It'll kind of make you go dizzy if you look at it enough. But the main theme for this is just how biodiverse our state is. There's all kinds of basically vegetation communities, which then produce their own unique animal communities. And so walking from the base of a mountain up to the top, you'll go through several of these, and there's not many animals or plants that you can find throughout. And so this slide is basically to show you how diverse our state really is. And I encourage you, it sounds like if you're in this program, you're probably getting outside a lot already anyway, but we have a lot to explore in the state. And now is actually a pretty good time to explore because it's not 150 degrees outside. So that's kind of nice. So now we're going to talk a bit about the Sonoran Desert itself. We are in the most lush desert in North America, which is sort of a paradox, right? Deserts shouldn't be lush, but compared to the Mojave Desert, the Great Basin Desert, the Chihuahuan Desert, the Sonoran Desert actually has a high diversity of plants and animals. And one of the reasons, well, there's two main reasons. Some people call the Sonoran Desert subtropical. That would apply to the parts of the Sonoran Desert in Mexico and in Baja. As we have seen over the last week or so, Miami is subtropical. Miami doesn't have the weather we've had in the last week. So I think subtropical is not the right term for Arizona. I think warm temperate might be a better term. So that's part of it, our latitude. And then we get rain twice a year, or in a good year, we get rain twice a year. We get the winter rains that we've had some of lately. Hopefully, you've been able to get some of them up in Maricopa County as well as the summer monsoon rains. And so the two rainfall patterns, two periods of rainfall separate the Sonoran Desert from the other ones, which only have one rainfall pattern, one rainfall period per year. Again, the vegetation is quite diverse here in the Sonoran Desert, and it's because of the rainfall patterns mostly. The Sonoran Desert is divided into 6 different subdivisions, and most of Arizona is in the Arizona Uplands subdivision. And you know you're in the Arizona Uplands if you see saguaros. That is the sort of diagnostic plant for the Arizona Upland subdivision. As you head west, though, you start, eventually it's too hot in the summer as we head west towards the Colorado River for saguaros. Other cacti do okay, barrel cacti and prickly pear and cholla, but there we get creosote bush. There's almost mono species plains that are basically just creosote bush. Creosote bush is a really hardy plant, but that's in a different subdivision. So here is a look at the different subdivisions. This came out of the Natural History of the Sonoran Desert, put out by the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum. And you can see, again, there's different colors, different patterns, and not everybody agrees with these. You could find different interpretations. But you'll notice, according to this map, Phoenix is, at least part of Phoenix, is in the lower Colorado River Valley subdivision, and Tucson is in the Arizona Uplands. I would disagree with that. I would think that Phoenix area is without a doubt in the Arizona Uplands, but that's just my opinion. You have a lot of saguaros, obviously, in the Phoenix area. So to me, that pretty much defines that you're in the Arizona Uplands. But this is all a human endeavor, right? And we don't all agree on everything. So that's why you can see different interpretations of this. And you can interpret it any way you like. There's nothing wrong. There's not a right interpretation. There's not a wrong interpretation. But this is just the interpretation that I use. So this is a classic example of an Arizona uplands. This is in Saguaro National Park East. On the southeast side of Tucson, you see you got the cactus forest there with the saguaros. You can see there's prickly pear. There's also mesquite trees and palo verdes, all the stuff you see in your neighborhood. This is the Arizona Upland subdivision. It's characterized by periodic freezes, at least historically, periodic freezes in the wintertime, and then hot summers, although not as hot as some other parts like the lower Colorado River Valley. That probably is a little bit of a shock to all of you in Phoenix, where it was like the sun for most of the summer. But technically, your summers are warm, obviously, but they're not as warm as they would be, say, like in Yuma. Saguaros, you can't really not talk about the Sonoran Desert and not talk about saguaros, in my opinion. They're absolutely remarkable plants. We're going to talk about them more in a bit, but this is in Sabino Canyon National Recreation, or part of the National Forest. It's a recreation area on the east side of Tucson, but you can see the normal, quote unquote, saguaro on the right, and then the cristate or crested saguaro on the left. And this is a mystery. Maybe one of you will be able to solve this mystery. No one is sure why the saguaros do this. There's been theories proposed that maybe there was frost damage, because cacti grow from the top up. They're not really growing from the bottom. So maybe there was frost damage. Maybe there was insect damage. Maybe there was an injury of some sort. Maybe there was some sort of pathogen that got introduced, and that caused this sort of abnormal growth form. What I really like about this saguaro is that whatever was wrong got fixed, because it's all sort of crested right in here, kind of, then it grows normal again. And so I have no explanation for that. So even, we as humans, we tend, I think, to think that we know a lot. And we do. I mean, we're not just, blindly walking around out in the desert. But this shows that even for very common, I would say charismatic megaflora, we don't know some of their secrets yet. And I think that's fantastic. We don't have to know everything. I mean, it's nice to obtain knowledge, but we don't have to know everything. Let there be mystery out there for other generations to solve or try to solve. But you've probably seen these crested saguaros. I think they're a really interesting sort of growth form of this fantastic plant. This is the flower, obviously state flower of Arizona, and it's a really beautiful, fragrant bloom. Typically opens in the evening and then will stay open all night to hopefully attract pollinators, but will also stay open until about midday the following day. And this is the saguaro's version of hedging its bets, because they are largely pollinated, it was thought, by bats, because they have the pale flowers out near the edge of the plant, very fragrant. All of those are characteristic of syndromes that are bat pollinated. And I think we could probably all agree that bats are pollinators of saguaros. They're much more important to agaves than they are to saguaros, but they're still important pollinators. What the question becomes is how important. And this is another case where we don't really know. There are theories out there that there may be another pollinator that's actually active during the daytime, and that might be why these saguaros stay open later, because for every time they produce one flower, that's a lot of energy that goes into producing that one flower. And since they only stay open for a matter of hours, that energy is wasted if you don't attract a pollinator. So it's in the plant's best interest to stay open as long as possible to ensure, or at least try to ensure, that you're going to attract a pollinator. So it's thought that the late closing time of these plants is a sort of evolutionary mechanism to sort of get any pollinator. At this point, the saguaro doesn't get visited by a bat overnight, and it gets to be dawn. Then the day starts to heat up, and the saguaro is almost like, okay, any of you pollinators, I don't care who it is, just one of you come over here and visit my flower, and then go visit another flower. That's kind of what they seem to be doing. You may have seen this up in the Phoenix area. This was 2020, because it wasn't that a great year. And what we saw was that the saguaros, you can see some flowers up here on the tops of the arms. They're up there, but that's normally where they flower. These going down the ribs, these are different. And there was a lot of the saguaros were basically flowering along the ribs, and that's unusual. And the botanists seem to think that's a sign of stress. Again, they're not 100% sure, but it's certainly noteworthy. And for the most part, they haven't flowered like this again since 2020. And there's this rumors out there that these plants are declining and they're in serious trouble. And that is not true. Are they, their numbers are, they're getting new recruitment, new plants into the population every year as old ones die. However, this does show that they are under some form of stress. It could be high temperatures, because if you remember, 2020 was a hot, dry year. Never mind, while COVID was raging across the globe, it was a hot, dry year. So that could have contributed to this. Last year was a hot, dry year, but they didn't do this. So who knows why they're doing it? I think we're sort of spitballing and says, okay, it seems as if it's a sign of stress, but what the actual stressor or stressors are is unclear at this point, but very likely it's probably related, my guess anyway, to heat and rainfall. So I mentioned earlier that they stay open later in the daytime. They don't, the flowers stay open so that other things can visit them. And white-winged doves, or as I first moved here, I thought their common name was those damn doves because people like to feed birds. They put the feed out, the doves come to visit. What goes in must come out, leaves a mess behind, and somehow in this whole equation, the doves are the dumb ones. But a lot of people don't like having the doves around, but they are pollinators. And a study was done a decade or two ago, probably a couple decades now, down at Bahia Kino, which is on the Sea of Cortez coast of Sonora. And Ted Fleming, who was a bat biologist, and his students actually put devices on saguaro flowers that prevented bats from visiting them. And then in the morning, when the bats had all gone to roost, they took them off. And what they found was the flowers that the bats were excluded from produced more fruit because the doves went to visit them once the bats had gone to roost. So the theory was, well, maybe white wings are actually the primary pollinator of saguaros. And I think it's still uncertain whether that's the case or not. I think it is safe to say they are a pollinator because when those flowers stay open, you can find all kinds of things on those flowers. A variety of insects. You can find house finches and orioles and even flycatchers, hummingbirds. All kinds of things are potential pollinators of saguaro once the dawn comes. But where the white wings really come into their own is when the fruits open because they switch their diet. When they typically get it, some will overwinter, but most of the population migrates south. And when they come back in the spring, they sort of act like big, bulky mourning doves. They're walking around on the ground. They're feeding on seeds, just like mourning doves are. When the saguaro flowers open, they sort of change and you get a lot of nectar and pollen in them. When the fruits open, that's all they're eating is saguaro fruit pulp. And so they're getting it for a couple of reasons. Number one, the nutrition, but more importantly, water. It's, the saguaro fruits are about 85% water. So it's a very nice alternative water source for them. But then they fly off, right? They get a full belly. It's like, oh, I can't have another mouthful of that delicious fruit. I better go take a nap. And so they fly off to a mesquite tree or a palo verde or wherever. And bird digestive tracts are actually pretty good at processing fruit. It goes through the digestive tract fairly quickly and then gets expelled out the other side. And you often will find young saguaros growing underneath mesquite trees or ironwoods or acacias or palo verdes. And those other plants are acting as what we call a nurse plant, providing those little seedlings from protection from the elements, protection from herbivores like javelina. Or another way to look at it is that tree is a former perching site for the white-winged dove because of the plant that's growing in there. So they're very important seed dispersers. And I think there's a reasonably good chance that somewhere along the line, if you haven't heard it already, you'll hear a comment, something to the effect of, those doves are such a pain. You can take that opportunity to tell people that I'm okay, they do some things that maybe we don't like, right? They make our backyards kind of a mess. Well, the Sonoran Desert might look very different if it weren't for the white-winged doves because of its pollination and, more importantly, its seed dispersing capability. This is the lesser long-nosed bat. This one, you can see its face is all covered with pollen going to a saguaro flower. This is a Merlin Tuttle photo. This species was taken off the endangered species list in 2018, I believe. And it could have recovered. I mean, its populations could have rebounded. Alternatively, we may have just got better at counting them, and they might not have been as low numbers as originally thought. But regardless of that, this is one of the bats that can also visit saguaro flowers. They also can visit your hummingbird feeders, typically in like September, October. There's this one and the Mexican long-tongued bat. Those are our two nectar-feeding bats. And you may have had the experience where you fill up your hummingbird feeder in the evening and you come out in the morning and there's not a drop left. Well, you were visited by bats last night. And personally, I think that's really cool. Some people don't like to feed the bats, so they'll bring the hummingbird feeders in the evening. That's it's fine. You can do that. But I also think it's really cool to have bats coming to your hummingbird feeders. But this is one of them. And I encourage you, I know it's tonight, Monday night, Tuesday night, whatever day of the week it is. What I would encourage you to do is maybe this weekend, have a little shot of tequila and then toast the bats when you're having it. Because if it weren't for these bats and their cousins, we wouldn't have any tequila. Maybe a good thing if we didn't have tequila. It's kind of a mixed bag, I suppose. But anyway, if you wanted to do that, you could do that. So there's a concept out there called keystone species, where a particular species has a disproportionate effect on ecosystem where it's found. And in the Sonoran Desert ecoregion, more specifically the Arizona uplands, the saguaro certainly qualifies as that because it provides resources for a bunch of different animals and plants. This species also qualifies because the Gila woodpecker, this is a male because of the red cap on top of his head, they make nest sites. They excavate their nest cavities, typically in saguaros, because their bill is not very good at sort of hammering through wood. It is pretty good at going through saguaros. You don't have to be a top-notch woodpecker to put a cavity in a saguaro, right? Because it's pretty succulent tissue. But the woodpeckers often will make a new cavity every time they are going to nest. And then those old cavities then become homes for a wide variety of other birds. Now, when they're making those cavities, they actually have to take a little bit, they excavate and they have to take a little bit of a break because the saguaro is going to respond to this intrusion by oozing sap. And the birds don't want to get the sap all over their feathers, so they let it harden. And you probably have heard or seen saguaro boots. Another way to that's if you holding a saguaro boot, what you're actually holding in your hands is the scar tissue that the cactus made in response to the woodpecker putting its nest there. And because it's much more weather resistant, you get the woody ribs and the saguaro boots. The actual flesh of the saguaro doesn't last very long when the saguaro dies because it's again mostly water, easy to decompose. But the saguaro boots and the woody ribs, they stick around for a long, long time. And so again, when you're holding a saguaro boot, some people think it kind of looks like a boot. Okay, this is where the tequila helps. If you have enough of the tequila, that looks just like a boot. I see where they got the name, but to me, not really so boot-like. But anyway, it's the old woodpecker cavity. So the Gila woodpecker, goes in there. The pair makes a nest, and then they use it. They raise their babies, and then they often will go find another nest or build another nest. And then it's open for birds like purple martins. Martins are the largest swallows in North America. And for the most part, they look black when they're flying around. This is the male. The female's a little bit paler on the underparts, and they're not really purple. They really should be called like the navy blue martins, but that's not. They didn't consult anybody when they came up with the name. But this bird will then use old saguaro nests. If there's no or woodpecker nest, if there's no woodpecker nest in the landscape, they're cavity nesters, but they can't build their own cavities. So they're relying on other species doing it for them. And that's where the Gila woodpecker comes in. Same with the ash-throated flycatcher and its cousin, the brown-crested flycatcher, which looks very similar. again, cavity nesters that don't build their own cavities, and they're asking the woodpeckers, you guys almost done with that? Because yeah, it looks really great and we'd like to move in. Elf owls. If you've not seen an elf owl, make it a priority this summer because they're adorable. They're like, we have sparrows bigger than the elf owls, like 5.5 inches long from the top of the head to the tip of the tail. But they're not found just in the saguaro forest. They go into riparian areas where there's like sycamores and cottonwoods. So they're a little bit more flexible in their habitat choice. But again, alpha owls will use old Gila woodpecker nests. And if you're in an area where there's not a lot of woodpeckers, you probably don't have many alpha owls either. Another woodpecker that likes to visit flowers is the gilded flicker, and it gets its name because of the yellow in the wings and tail. You can see some of it here. You typically really see it best when they're flying, but that's where the name comes from. So the gilded flicker is bigger, a couple inches bigger than the Gila woodpecker, and it does the same thing. It's using saguaros, among other substrates, to construct its nest, and the saguaro responds in the exact same way. Typically, gilded flicker nests are higher up on the saguaro than the Gila woodpecker nest, and obviously the hole is going to be a little bit bigger. So if you're walking along and you're out in the Sonoran Desert, you can look and you can often tell what was a gilded flicker nest and what was a Gila woodpecker nest by its location and the size of the opening. Anyway, gilded flicker builds its nest, kind of goes through the same routine, and now bigger birds can use it, like the American kestrel, the bird causing mayhem in Anne's yard. They're also caviting beautiful little falcons. This is a male. The female doesn't have those bluish gray tones on the wings, and she's sort of rusty with black bars going across the back. But again, the Gila woodpecker nest is not quite big enough for the American kestrel. So in desert valleys, they're relying either on natural cavities, maybe a rot hole or something like that, or on gilded flicker nests. Same with the western screech owl. You might have these guys in your eye. Western screech owls are pretty adaptable and pretty flexible, so they're not rare in urban and suburban areas, but you kind of have to have the nest sites for them. And this is another species that will use old gilded flicker nest because bigger bird needs a bigger opening to fit in. Other animals we see in the Sonoran Desert, Gila monster. Hopefully you've had a chance to see a Gila monster out in the wild. If you haven't yet, it should be on your bucket list because it's one of the coolest things ever. So Gila monsters, I don't really like the name monster. It's not like they're trying to attack everything that moves. They're kind of slow-moving lizards. They have that very beaded look. In fact, they're sometimes called beaded lizards because of the scale pattern on them. They use their tail as a fat storage organ, but they are venomous. And for a long time, it was thought only Gila monsters and their more tropical cousin, the beaded lizard, the Mexican beaded lizards, were the only venomous lizards on Earth. And that's no longer true. So there are Gila monsters and beaded lizards are very closely related to an old world group like Australia, Australia, Africa, tropical Asia, called the monitor lizards. They're pretty big. And some of them, and these guys are closely related to them. And some of those have been proven to now have venom glands as well, including the world's largest lizard, which is the Komodo dragon, which lives on only one island in the Indonesian archipelago. So, maybe they've lost a little bit of their uniqueness, but nothing else looks like these guys, except for their beaded lizard cousins, which are in Mexico. They don't get, they're in southern Sonora. They don't come really that close to the border. But they have, their enlarged upper, that's where the venom glands are on the on the lower jaw. And they don't have a very good venom delivery system. They basically bite and hold on and let the venom flow into your hand or the wound, wherever the bite is. And there's a saying out there that only drunks and herpetologists get bitten by Gila monsters. And so if you're all neither one, you might be a herpetologist, but I'm sure you're not drunk, so you have nothing to worry about. So what's interesting about these lizards is their venom, it seems, evolved for defense, because they're feeding on things like bird eggs, bird nestlings, like rodents and rabbits still in the nest, stuff that's not hard to subdue. And so, unlike rattlesnakes or other vipers or coral snakes, it seems as though the venom delivery system in these guys evolved as in a defensive capacity as opposed to a food obtaining capacity. And um, I've been told if they bite you, you almost have to pry them off your wherever they're biting, because they hold on with vice-like tenacity. But very simple. Don't get bitten by one. You actually have to make an effort. You have to be interacting with these lizards in order for them to do that. You're all much smarter than the average person out there, so I know you won't have to worry about that. But a very, very cool animal. I'm so happy that we have them in our area, because every time I see a Gila monster, it's just a joy to see one. And you kind of wish them well. The rattlesnakes, the diamondbacks, there's a baseball team up in your area that obviously like our rattlesnakes so much, we named a baseball team after them. So this is the rattlesnake that probably, well, not probably, statistically is the most dangerous in the US, because it's common and they like to live near people. So there's a lot of snakes, a lot of people, the number of interactions between the two can go up. And that's why they're dangerous. Their venom is not in the top 10 Arizona rattlesnakes in terms of its toxicity. There's 10 other rattlesnakes that at least that have more toxic venom. But they are, I mean, anytime anyone is bitten by a rattlesnake, it is a medical issue and you need to get to medical treatment. So this snake, rattlesnakes are, I think, are like the peak of snake evolution, because they are extremely well adapted to their predatory lifestyle. So they have little pits between their eyes and their nostrils that are heat-seeking devices. So it's kind of like, you watch those movies and Arnold Schwarzenegger's about to go in with the bad guys, and they're outside in the street and they got that thermal cam. Like, yeah, there's 3 of them in the kitchen. That's kind of what rattlesnakes do. They're able to detect differences in heat from the surrounding area, and that's how they can find their food. They also have a very good sense of vision. And once they find their food, they're very well equipped to take care of it. They have the big fangs that fold up into the roof of their mouth that are so out of the way when a situation like this, where the snake isn't ready to strike. However, when they start to open the mouth, those fangs start to come out, and now they're ready for action. And then they have the very potent venom there's a venom gland. Think of the venom gland as like a little bulb, like on the bulb on your turkey baster. And there's muscles that go around it, and those muscles contract and it squeezes the venom out. And that's very efficient. So oftentimes, depending on the prey item, rattlesnakes will bite and then release it. If it is a mammal, if it is a bird, they tend to hold on, because the bird's going to get bitten, then it's going to fly away. It's probably not going to do very well for very long, but the chances of the rattlesnake finding it are not very good either. And so with birds, they tend to bite and hold on. With like rabbits or rodents, they bite and let go, and then they can follow the chemical trail of their prey to where it is, and then they can feed on it. So absolutely remarkable animals. In my view, we don't need to be afraid of rattlesnakes, but we do need to respect them. And these are snakes that will stand their ground. A lot of snakes see us coming and they're like, I just want to get out of here. Because of their defensive capabilities, these snakes will say, yeah, I'm not moving. You go around me. And that's always a good idea. So if you're out in the field, and the field in this case could be like your backyard, or you're walking the dog down the block, always be vigilant, especially in the warmer months. They could be out, and we had a pretty warm afternoon. They could be out, like sunning themselves near their sort of hibernation site. But once it warms up, they're going to be out. And once the temperatures start to climb, they become more nocturnal in their habits. So if you're out, always be vigilant, whenever you're outside, because besides rattlesnakes, there's prickly plants and all kinds of stuff. But there, just be vigilant. But at night, make sure you take a light source with you, because if you hear the rattle, if you've never heard the rattle, when you hear it the first time, the very primitive part of your brain will say, "Pay attention to that sound," because it. Even though the first time I heard it, I was like, "What is that?" And I looked down, there was a rattlesnake a few feet away. I'm like, "Okay, got it, great." But you don't have to run in fear. They're not chasing you down. That's not what they do. So, in my view, if you stay at least 5 feet away from a rattlesnake, it can't do anything to you. They're not going to launch themselves at you. They can basically go 2/3 of their body length. And we don't get many rattlesnakes that are more than 5 feet anymore. So that's why I say if you're 5 feet away, you're probably fine. You can take your photos, admire them for the remarkable evolutionary beings that they are, and then walk around them. Let them go about their day. You can go about yours. Eventually, your heart rate will come back down again. It might take a few minutes, but it'll come back down. And if you're in Arizona, except for the top of the San Francisco peaks, where there's a little bit of alpine tundra up there, um, reptiles don't like alpine tundra. They don't like those two words together. If you're anywhere else in the state, there are rattlesnakes near you, and Arizona is the rattlesnake capital of the United States in terms of number of species. For some reason, that doesn't make it into the tourism brochures. I don't really know why. I think it should, but they're out there, and just be aware of them. And they're really remarkable creatures. We also have tarantula. When I first moved here, I was like, Arizona must be a word that translates to the land of pestilence, because we have every plant's got spines on it, it seems. We have scorpions, rattlesnakes, Gila monsters, black widows, tarantulas. It's like, oh my goodness. Tarantulas are really cool spiders, and I realize that some of you out there are not big fans of spiders. Spiders have a serious public relations problem. However, tarantulas are really cool spiders. So this is the Arizona blonde is the one that we see most often. This is the male. If you see a tarantula out walking around, typically around the monsoon season, it's usually a male looking for a mate. The females typically spend most of their lives in their burrows, and the only time you would probably see one walking around is if the burrow got flooded or otherwise disturbed. They're bigger and paler. In the spider world, it's pretty common for the female spiders to be larger than the males of the same species, sometimes dramatically so. But this is, so tarantulas, I know they give people the willies, but they're really gentle giants. You really have to make an effort for at least these species. I'm not saying this is true of all the tarantulas in the world, but for Arizona blondes, you kind of have to make an effort to get bitten by them. And you're all smarter than that, so we don't have to worry about that. But even if you were to get bitten, it's no worse than the bee sting. You don't have to run to the emergency room and waste the next 6 hours of your life waiting for some medical person to come, look at your wound, because you're probably going to, first of all, the pain's probably going to be gone by then. And second of all, the venom is not considered dangerous to people. Might hurt a little bit, but it's no worse as long as you're not like a bee sting. If you're not allergic to the bee venom, I mean, it's annoying, kind of hurts a little bit, but you don't have to run to the hospital. The same is true of the tarantulas. And like I said, we also have scorpions. And what's really fascinating, first of all, if you wanted, you're sitting there, it's like, what group could I study? I really want to make some discoveries. And what group should I study? Well, may I suggest scorpions? Because in the last, I would say 10 years, maybe 15 years, there's been over a dozen new species of scorpion discovered in Arizona. And I don't know if we're the capital scorpion capital of the world, but we're certainly in like the top 3. So that's really cool. But scorpions are related to spiders. They're both arachnids. And for most of them, their venom, again, is no worse than the bee sting. There is one exception to that. That's the bark scorpion. That has, it's sort of more almost like orangey than this one, and it has very thin appendages. So it kind of has this almost delicate look to it. But other than that one, if you get stung, it's probably not anything to really worry about, assuming you're in reasonably good health. And even if you got stung by the bark scorpion, um, you could go to the emergency room. If it makes you feel better, then obviously go to the emergency room. If it's gonna give you peace of mind, then go for it. Nothing wrong with that. However, another thing you could do is you could say, I just got stung by a scorpion, and call the poison control center. And what they're probably going to ask you is like, are you breathing okay? Yes. Okay, great. I mean, might want to take like ibuprofen or something for the pain, but as long as you're breathing okay, you're probably fine. If that changes, then call 911. But that's pretty rare. There's a lot of bark scorpions out in southern Arizona. There's a lot of people in southern Arizona, and most people, even if they got stung by that species, do just fine. Okay, so we live obviously in a rather arid environment, and there are basically a couple of challenges that are present in arid environments that aren't present in other ones. Obviously, water acquisition and then holding on to that water is a big one. Also, and sort of related to the first one is you don't want to lose that water. And then third, the protection from intense heat or cold. Cold, not so much, but we get cold nights, so you have to have a little bit of tolerance to at least some cold. Otherwise, you would make it. So, and then there's all the challenges that occur in all habitats for all things. And so water acquisition and storage is a big one. And so we see, the cacti. Every cacti is a succulent. They store water, they get it, they have shallow root systems, they absorb the water as soon as they can from the soil, and then they store it. And once they've done that, they don't want to give that water up to some lousy javelina or something like that. So they protect themselves with spines. That doesn't, by the way, discourage the javelina very much. They'll still chew on cactus, and I cringe every time I see them. They're like, what are you guys doing? But they're probably like a prickly pear pad. They're not eating it for the nutrition. They're eating it for the water. And so cacti and agaves, and to a somewhat lesser extent, things like yuccas and sotol and bear grasses, they store water. Now, when you store water, you can store it either in your trunk, in your leaves, in your branches, in your roots. It doesn't matter. You're just storing water somewhere. And then with the water loss part of that, once you get it, you don't want to lose it. So cacti do this really a lot, not just cacti, many desert plants do this really cool thing where they store carbon dioxide in their tissues as an organic acid during the daytime. And then when it becomes nightfall, the temperature goes down, the humidity goes up, and now they can open those pores, the stomata in their stems. And that's how kind of like plants breathe. They take in carbon dioxide and they release oxygen and water vapor. So in a way, they kind of do photosynthesis in a way at night, which is really cool because you need daylight to be able to do that. And the reason they do that is to reduce water loss. There are plenty of other things. We talked about this already with some of the succulents, but there's also other ways to get around, if you're a plant, to get around the arid environment. For example, you can go dormant. You could just say, you know what, haven't had rain in a while. I'm just going to cut my losses and wait for better times. And that's what ocotillo do. They look dead much of the time. Then the rains come in. If it's enough rain, they'll sprout leaves and they'll do their photosynthesis. And if the rains stop at some point, usually within a week or two, they drop their leaves and they look dead again. That's called drought tolerance. Another thing you can do is what's called drought avoidance. And that's basically, you just like, I'm not doing any of that. I'm gonna wait for the rains to come, and then I'll be good. But until that happens, just pretend I'm not here. And this is what we see, like a lot of our spring annuals, the plants that put on the wildflower shows, those are basically drought avoiders, and they will sit in the soil as a seed until there's enough rain for it to germinate. And then once that happens, they need additional rains for growth and for flowering and things like that. But that's what they do. That's why some years are much better than others for the wildflower show in the springtime, because there's not, some years we have more rain than others. And the rains kind of have to start in November and then have roughly an inch of rain through per month through about March or even April. And then if we have that, that's when you get these really spectacular floral displays, but we don't have that all the time. And that's why it varies from year to year. Another plant that avoids the drought is the devil's claw. Devil's claw is more of a perennial, which comes, takes more than 1 year to complete its life cycle. And what they'll do is right now, the devil's claw, if you find one, it's all dead. All of last year's tissue is dead. But the roots are doing just fine under the ground. And they won't send up new shoots unless there's enough rainfall. So kind of doing the same thing as the spring annuals, but kind of doing it in a slightly different way. Oh, here's Ocotillo. This is obviously after we've had some
Jeff,
rain. Yeah,
are we good to take a pause for about
sure.
10 minutes?
Absolutely.
All right. Okay, everybody, we'll do a bio break for 10 minutes and come back at 6:58.
And please write any questions you have in the chat so that we can address those at the end of Jeff's presentation.
So hope everybody had a good break, by the way. The Ocotillo is one of those drought tolerators. If we don't get rain, it'll look dead and then it'll come back. Desert marigold, this is one of those classic, I don't want to say spring annuals because they'll almost flower year round if there's enough rainfall, but it's one of those plants that becomes most or first noticeable each year during the springtime. And the seeds of this plant can survive in the soil for multiple years, waiting for conditions to be just right, assuming, of course, they avoid the seed predators like birds and rodents and insects and things like that. And then devil's claw, this might be Althea actually. This is the other one. Very sticky foliage, and you can see the little hairs on the leaves and on the flowers. But this is the plant that basically survives as a root and like a tuber in the soil, and then will start to grow once things get better. Mourning doves, you're all familiar with mourning doves, one of the most common birds in North America. But this photo was taken in my backyard in June, which, as we all know, is a little bit toasty out there. And so this bird looks like it's incubating its eggs, but it may not be. It may actually be shading them because if it were to incubate them when they were this hot, it could be lethal to the embryos. And most of our birds, at least in the desert valleys, most of them will take that really hot time of the year off. So late May until the beginning of the monsoon, they'll just like, yeah, we're not doing any of that business until the rains come. And it also cools off, the humidity goes up, it's a little bit more tolerable. And mourning doves, they're kind of like, we're going to raise as many broods in a year as we possibly can. So one of the ways they're able to do that is to continue to breed through that hot period, but they're actually shading their eggs more than they're incubating them. Kangaroo rats are adorable little mammals that have no neck. It's like the head just gets, rammed right in there between the shoulders. And they're often held up as really desert adapted mammals. And as we said, you have a couple of challenges in the desert. One is the water issue. The second is typically the heat issue. And it turns out kangaroo rats are really good at one and not very good at all at the other. And so this is what a kangaroo rat mound looks like. It's basically a mound, often under a shrub. This one's kind of out in the open, but with multiple entrances and exits. So they're kind of a distinctive look to them. But kangaroo rats are mostly nocturnal. They do all their feeding at night. They go out there feeding a lot on seeds, but they'll feed on fruits and other things. And they have these fur-lined cheek pouches, and they stuff the seeds in their cheek pouches, and they hop back to their burrow, and then they unfold their cheek pouches, and then the seeds go on into the burrow, and they go back out and they get more. And where the kangaroo rats are really good is the water issue, because kangaroo rats can survive without ever drinking free water. That's not to mean they won't take advantage of it when it's available. What that means is they can live their entire lives without having to do so, because they can, during the process of digestion, they can metabolically create water that suits all of their needs, which is pretty brilliant if you live in the desert. The other thing, the heat thing, is what they're not very good at. And this probably is why they're nocturnal, because some researchers did a study about 30 years ago now, where they let the kangaroo rats go out to feed, but then they wouldn't let them back in. So they kind of blocked the entrances to their burrow holes, which I don't know. I mean, it is what it is, I suppose. But anyway, the kangaroo rats, they came back and they're probably quite surprised that they couldn't get back in there again. And what they found was that they went into heat stress pretty quickly once the sun came up. So they're probably nocturnal, not only because there's fewer predators and all that sort of thing, but it could be because they have to be, because they wouldn't survive in the heat of the day above ground. You know, the desert plants, I'm going to kind of move through these a little bit quickly. Desert mesquite, you know, it's sort of the safe way of the Albertsons of the desert, because so many things feed on it in one way or another. Very common plant. It's in the legume family, although recently, within the last couple of months, it's been placed in a different genus. It's not in Prosopis anymore. But in the plant world, if you try to keep up with all the different generic changes and family changes, your head will explode. So, you know, there's a lot of them going on. But Prosopis is their usual gene, or was up until recently their usual genus. Very common. Now, if you were in Oregon or Washington, or I grew up in New Hampshire, if this plant was in New Hampshire, we'd call it a shrub. Here in Arizona, it definitely qualifies as a tree because it's taller than we are. So, and it has only one trunk. That's kind of the botanical definition, that trees only have one trunk, shrubs have multiple trunks. Anyway, the flowers typically appear in the spring, and these are a smorgasbord for a variety of insects. You can see all kinds of butterflies, moths, beetles, flies, bees, wasps visit these flowers. And what you can do is sort of pull up a chair and just let the show come to you, and you'll see all kinds of diversity on these flowers. Marine blues are small butterflies, about the size, bigger than a dime, about a nickel, we'll say. If you could put a nickel on this guy and you wouldn't be able to see much of it. But their caterpillars feed on mesquite blossoms, not on the leaves, but on mesquite blossoms. And there's a couple of other butterflies that do the same thing. With insects that are specific to their host plant like this, if you don't have the host plant around you, you will not see the insects. So if you're thumbing through a book or online and you say, oh, that is a really cool butterfly, I want to see one someday. Two things you need to find out. Number one, what its caterpillars eat, and then find the plant. And number two, find out when the adults are in flight. If you can satisfy both of those requirements, I think you have a pretty good chance of seeing the butterfly or moth. The Palmer's meadowlark. This is actually on desert broom, but its caterpillars also feed on mesquite. However, they're feeding on the mesquite leaves, not the mesquite flowers. So again, you don't have the mesquite, you don't have these guys. The mesquite girdler beetle, it's a longhorn beetle, so it's in the family Cerambycidae, but it's really cool beetle. And you may never have seen the adult before, but you very well could have seen the effects of the adult, because they live up to their name, part of their name. They're not only on mesquite, they can be on other trees as well, but they do seem to have a pretty fondness for mesquite. So in the summer, usually later second half of the monsoon season, maybe beyond that, the adults emerge, and their main job in the world of adult insects is to find a mate and create the next generation. So the males and females find each other, they mate, and then the females go to lay eggs. And the females, when they lay their eggs, the first thing they do is they girdle a mesquite branch, and they basically use their chewing mouth parts to chew all the way around, very, very precise chewing. And in this particular photo, everything to the right of that girdle mark is dying or dead. And then everything to the left, that's where the tree is, the trunk is. And so what you'll see is a mesquite tree with all kinds of green leaves and nice healthy branches. You might find one or two branches that are dead because you have those sort of straw-colored dead leaves. If you take that straw-colored, the dead branch, and you kind of follow it down, you'll very likely eventually encounter these chew marks. And so again, it's diversity that's out there. Again, not restricted to the mesquite, but they do seem to have a fondness for mesquite. Round-tailed ground squirrels, another common denizen of the desert. They feed a lot on seeds. You can see this one's at a bird feeder. It's chewing on black oil sunflower seeds, but they really like mesquite pods when the mesquite pods are ripe. And those pods sometimes be about as long as these guys are. And so what they'll do is they'll actually climb up into the trees, even though they're ground squirrels. They're kind of a little bit awkward at it, but they'll climb up into the trees. They chew the pods off. They pick them up, and they run them back into their burrows. And they feed on those during these sorts of months because the round-tailed ground squirrels don't hibernate, but you don't see them above ground much either during the winter months. But they're able to do that because they're feeding on the mesquite pods and maybe Palo Verde pods that they harvested last summer. They're able to survive on them during the winter months. The coyote, not only do they like golf courses a lot, but they also like mesquite pods a lot. And the reason for that, first of all, they're pretty nutritious. So they're getting a lot of good nutrition from them. But more importantly, from the coyote's perspective, the mesquite pods are not trying to get away from you. So they're a very easy source of food that they don't have to work hard. So not only are they getting good nutrition from eating it, they're also not burning a lot of calories trying to get it. And you can find coyote scat during that time of year when it's almost nothing but mesquite pods. And that's because they're feeding on it. So, even though coyotes are carnivores, technically, they're in the order Carnivora, but this is an animal that will take advantage of mesquite pods, prickly pear fruit, all that sort of stuff, whatever's available. Soap tree yucca. This is another very common sort of succulent plant. So one of the differences between yuccas and agaves is yuccas, once they reach maturity, flower every year. And you can see this, you have several different years worth of flower stalks up there, whereas agaves only flower once in their lives and then they die. So that's one of the differences. Both yuccas and agaves are now in the asparagus family, which isn't really that surprising if next time you're in the grocery store, if you look at an asparagus spear, it's basically a really small version of an agave spear, the flowering stalk. So it's kind of one of those things when they moved, it's like, yeah, that kind of makes a lot of sense now that I think about it. But the yucca and the yucca moth have a very intimate relationship. The only pollinator of yuccas are yucca moths. And the only things the yucca moth caterpillars will eat are the developing seeds of the yuccas. So this is a very, very close relationship. If you lose one, you're going to lose the other. And this is a female. It's inside of soap tree yucca flower. And she's she actually gathers pollen. She has specialized mouth parts that then pollinate the flower, and then she'll lay eggs. And then as the developing seeds are occurring, that's what the caterpillars will hatch from the eggs, and that's what will feed on. Each yucca species has only one species of yucca moth that will pollinate it for the most part. So again, a very intimate relationship between a plant and its pollinator. And to me, I sort of take a holistic approach to all of this. Nothing is an island out there unto itself. There's all sorts of connections from a plant to a variety of animals and plants to fungi, all kinds of stuff going on. So oftentimes, if there's a particular thing you really like, whether it's plant or animal, even fungus for that matter, if you start to investigate it more, you'll start to see these connections between it and other things in the same environment. Okay, the Sky Islands. The name first appeared apparently in an article on Arizona Highways in 1943. That magazine has been around for a long time, and it still is a fantastic magazine. So good on the Arizona Highways people. But Nat Dodge came up with the idea, and it's basically, summarized islands in the mountains surrounded by a sea of desert. Or another way of looking at it is mountains surrounded by inhospitable habitat, because many of the animals that live up in the mountains will not survive down in the desert, and vice versa, for that matter. The term really became popular in 1967 when Weldon Heald wrote a book called Sky Island, where he kind of dedicated the entire book to talking about these Sky Islands. And so we're going to kind of go through them as you go up in the mountains, around mostly southern Arizona, mostly southeastern Arizona, southwestern New Mexico, and then into northern Mexico. But there are about 65 mountain ranges between the Sierra Madre Occidental in Mexico and the Colorado Plateau that fit the definition. And they're essentially biological stepping stones between the Sierra Madre Occidental, one major geological feature, and the Colorado Plateau, which is another major geological feature. So they stretch from basically the Patagonias, Huachucas, and Palancios. Palancios are right on the border of Arizona and New Mexico, north to the Superstitions, Pinals, and Santa Teresa. So here's a map. This is going to be on the quiz, by the way. Oh, we mentioned there's a quiz. On the quiz, there's going to be this map, and you're going to have to put the right numbers to correspond with the mountain ranges that are on the left. No, obviously we're not going to do that. But here, so this is up here. We got the Superstitions, and you can see it kind of, the plateau is sort of up here. And then these are these different ranges, a few in the boot heel of New Mexico, and then all the way down to basically the Hermosillo area, or a little bit further south. And so all of them share characteristics that they're mountains surrounded by a desert. It could be desert grassland, it could be the Sonoran Desert, it could be the Chihuahuan Desert, but it's surrounded by inhospitable habitat for the animals and plants that live up on the mountains. So back in the late 1800s, there was a guy named C. Hart Merriam who kind of came up with the idea of life zones, and basically it was a way to classify plant communities. And so that, even though the life zone idea is sort of fallen out of favor in some ways, whenever we're talking about habitats, we're usually talking about the plant communities. They often are defined by the plants that occupy them more so than the animals that occupy those same habitats. And he did his studies up in the San Francisco Peaks up near Flagstaff. And then Forrest Shreve, who worked out of Tucson and other places, he did a lot of legwork beginning in 1915 to sort of more precisely describe these changes in vegetation patterns as you move up the mountain. So basically, for every 1,000 feet you gain in elevation, the average temperature drops by 4 degrees Fahrenheit, and the annual precipitation goes up by about 4.5 inches. So as you go up the mountains, it gets cooler and it gets wetter. And if you were to walk from like the base of the mountains to the top, assuming you're in one of the Sky Island ranges, would be akin to walking from the Mexican border to the Canadian border, because the plants at the top of these Sky Island mountains are very similar to plants you'd find on the US-Canadian border. And the plants in the valleys at the base are plants that continue well into Mexico. And so that shows the differences in, how as you gain elevation, you gain some plants, and then some will drop out because maybe they can't handle the cold, or maybe it's even too wet for them up the mountains. And the same is going on with the animals, such that there are very few animals and plants that can live through, that you can see from in the valleys and up at the tops of the mountains. And those that can do that typically are soaring birds. So things like common ravens, red-tailed hawks, turkey vultures, those animals you can't see, but you're not going to see round-tailed ground squirrels up on the mountains because their niche is occupied by somebody else up there. So this is basically these names on the left, the lower Sonoran, upper Sonoran. Those were the names that Miriam gave to these. And then these are the Sonoran desert scrub, Madrean evergreen woodland. These are names that Shreve basically came up with it, or may have been adjusted more recently than Miriam's work. But you can see the lower Sonoran, that's where we see our saguaro cacti. As you go up, upslope, things start to change. And at the top of the mountain, again, you're up in the Canadian life zone, which is similar to the Canadian border. So it's really fascinating to be able to do this because you can, hit the trail early in the morning when you're in the desert, you're seeing cactus wrens and curve-billed thrashers and mesquite trees and all that sort of stuff. And then you get, as you're walking up, those things drop out, replaced by other things. And by the time you reach the top, pretty much nothing's the same as where you started. This is another look at that. This is higher up. Obviously, we don't have any alpine tundra in our area. Timberline is right about there. But another important aspect. So not only is elevation important, latitude is also important because as you go further north, biodiversity tends to decline in most groups. And that's because the climate gets more rigorous, we'll say, or harsh, you might say. So there's a lot more plants in the Sonoran Desert of southeastern Arizona, plant species and animal species, than there are in the Rockies of Montana, because the Rockies of Montana have winter that might last for 6 months. And down here, we don't have that. So latitude has an impact, elevation has an impact, but so does aspect. And that is which direction the slopes are facing. So I'll give you an example. This is the Catalina Mountains. This is down low. If you've been up the Catalina Highway, this is near Molino Basin. This is looking at a south-facing slope. Okay, so the whole slope is facing south. I turned and took this picture. This is the same spot, the north-facing slope. And it's not lush. It's not the Amazon. I understand that, but there's a lot more plants. And the reason is the north slope, the moisture stays in the soil for longer and it's not as hot. And those are both things that generally are beneficial to plant growth. South-facing slopes, that moisture goes away faster and it's hotter. And so when we're talking about these different habitats and going up in the mountains, latitude, elevation, and aspect are all part of it. So don't forget aspect. Okay, so this is where we're starting. Here's our Arizona uplands. We get in our car. It's June. It's a little bit toasty. We're gonna get out of here. We see choyas. They're everywhere. We're seeing barrel cacti, beautiful flowers that late in the summer, typically like August. Wonderful cacti. You can't, by the way, get water out of these guys. You may have heard this rumor that if you're lost in the desert and you're starving or thirsty, you can get water out of a barrel cactus. Like you open it up and there's just like a bottle of water in there waiting for you to drink. That is not the case. First of all, you're going to lose more water in the form of blood and sweat trying to get to it. And then once you get the thing open, if you persist long enough, it's going to look nasty. It's going to look very mucusy in there. So don't do that. Don't get lost in the desert. Palo Verde, another familiar plant lower in the desert, basically turned its entire surface into a photosynthesizing substrate. Very ingenious evolutionary innovation there. Desert ironwood, another tree in the legume family. The legumes do quite well in arid environments. So the acacias, I don't know, they've changed that up a little bit. So now I think the acacias might be I don't know. Anyway, I still call them legumes because they still have like a bean pod as a fruit, but genetics are different. Lucy's warbler, if you're a birder, warblers are often a favorite group because they're very colorful. Lucy's warbler is sort of on the drab end of the scale as far as warblers go, but I really like it because it's in there with us during the summer. All these other warblers are up in the mountains. They're having a great time. The Lucys are out there. Yep, another hot one. It'll probably be the same tomorrow. So these will typically start to show up in southern Arizona like the middle of March end of March. And then if you have mesquites in your neighborhood or in your yard, you very likely have Lucy's warblers around. One of only 2 cavity nesting warblers in North America. The other is the prothonotary warbler that lives in the southeast. Desert spiny lizards, very common. They like to do the push-ups. That's kind of a territorial thing for them. The marine blue butterfly, earlier we saw the closed wings. This is the upper wings. And one of my frequent comments is that we humans are not very good at naming things. We miss the mark fairly often. And so if this looks like the blue of the ocean to you, then it was named perfectly. It looks more purple and brown to me, but it's the marine blue. And this is a valley species, again, feeding on mesquite. And we have the mule deer down here. You know, the big ears, the black tip to the tail. But these guys, at least in Arizona, if you go further north, they tend to be much higher in the mountains than they are here because things are different, like in Oregon and Washington. But the mule deer, then we move up. Okay, so now we're getting into this Madrean evergreen woodland, as it's called, and this is dominated by oaks and junipers, mostly. So we have alligator juniper, we have several different oak species. Our oaks, most of them are evergreen, and like I said, I grew up back east, and when I first came out here, I would go looking for the oak woodlands because there was cool things to be seen in the oak woodlands. And I'm looking around and I'm like, there's not an oak around. And little did I know at the time I was surrounded by them. It's just that none of their leaves looked like the oaks I was familiar with. So with the exception of one species up higher, they don't have those lobed leaves. Anyway, so we're a little bit cooler, a little bit wetter. Alligator juniper is one of the diagnostic plants. It's one of the lower growing conifers. I mean, it's not as low as desert Mormon tea or ephedra, as it's also called, or joint fir, but it's much lower than the pines usually. Their leaves are kind of scales, sort of pressed or stuck on the stems. They have a very cool looking bark. This one, in contrast to what I just said about us being bad at naming things, this one, we nailed it because it does look like the back of an alligator. Also have oaks. Mexican blue oak is one of the first oaks in elevation you're likely to encounter. It's got these oval leaves, kind of has a slight bluish tinge to them where the name comes from. But this is kind of a Mexican tree species that just barely makes it across the border. Doesn't extend very far north at all. Then this is the home of black-throated gray warblers. So still not really colorful as far as warblers go. We're going to get to those guys, but this is, you know, a warbler that is perfectly happy in this habitat, will nest in it, sometimes even overwinter in it. We have the Rita blues up here. Rita blues are a challenging group that feed only on buckwheats as caterpillars. So if you're not seeing any buckwheats around, don't bother looking for these guys because they won't be there. And then we have the white-tailed deer. White-tailed deer tend to be higher elevation. There are places where you can find both deer not like together, but in the same habitat at certain times of the year. But in Arizona, if you get up into the mountains, the deer you're seeing the most are going to be the whitetails. The muleys are usually down lower. And then you get up a little bit higher. And now we're into more of the pine zone. In this photo, there's a bunch of oaks. The smaller stature stuff is oaks. You have a large pine. And that white bark thing is a sycamore. And sycamores are easy trees to recognize because of their bark color. But again, so there could still be some junipers here, but they're not as tall. They're not as common as they were where we just were. And sycamores are a tree that is really only found in riparian areas. So they tend to be sort of linear in their distribution, and they're usually in places where water is readily available, either flowing as creeks or flowing underground. And so this is another habitat habitat that sort of bisects these other habitats. And in lower elevations, the Arizona sycamores are replaced by like Fremont cottonwood and Gooding's willow. So all three trees are sort of in the same habitat, but they occur at different elevations. This is the leaves. To me, they kind of look like a star a little bit. Right now, they're going to look barren because they do shed their leaves in the fall. But here's the bark, a very distinctive tree, like I said. Sometimes it's more mottled green and brown, but a lot of white shows through. Silverleaf oak. Now this is going to be a little bit on the hillsides, or maybe even mixed in with the cottonwoods, or not the cottonwoods, the sycamores. Now the silverleaf oak. Hopefully you're looking at this tree and going, "That's a really horrible name," because the leaves aren't very silvery, and you would be right. This is the top side of the leaves. They have a little. You can't really see. They have their leaves end in like a little prickle, little like tiny spiny tip. But the name comes from the underside of the leaves. The underside, the top side is a lustrous green, and the underside is very almost like white. And when it gets windy, the whole tree looks kind of silvery. And but these leaves are very coarse. They're almost leathery. They're not nice and soft. This is also where you're seeing that leaf oak and other oaks. You're also getting into the ponderosa pine forest. Ponderosa pine is one of the dominant pines in much of the West. Ponderosas are sort of self-pruning. A lot of conifers are actually, but as the tree gets taller, there's less and less light that's hitting the lower branches because of the other trees around it. So eventually they'll stop producing needles on those trees and on those branches, and they'll eventually fall off. This is the pollen cone. So the conifers, the pines, spruces, firs, cypresses, junipers, they don't produce flowers. They're not in that group of plants. But they do produce pollen cones and seed cones. And pollen cones produce prodigious amounts of pollen. Where I grew up, we used to have a pond near our house that in the spring would be covered with this little layer of yellow. And the little layer of yellow was pine pollen. And if you hit a pine tree with a baseball bat, this cloud of yellow pollen would come up. So they are very prodigious. They do produce a lot of pollen, but these are relatively short-lived cones. They won't stay on the tree for very long. If you're going and you're picking up pine cones on the ground, those are the female cones or the seed cones. Those aren't these things. Anyway, this is what ponderosa pine pollen cones look like. And then we have Douglas fir, which is not a true fir. It gets into the botanical subtleties of why it's not. But Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, those are the two most important timber trees in the West. The pines, they tend to have their needles in groups called fascicles. There is one pine, the one leaf pinyon, which has bundles of only one. But most pines have like 2, 3, 5 needles per bundle. Firs do not. Firs have the needles that are attached individually to the tree, and that's why it's pretty easy to tell. I mean, pines are pretty easy to recognize. The other ones can be a little bit more tricky, but pines are pretty easy to recognize. This is the seed cone of a Doug fir, and how they're recognized is they have these structures called bracts on them. They have like 3 points. And so, and these are the scales, these sort of things right here. The scales on Doug fir cones are very thin, whereas on pine cones, they're much thicker. So the cones have a different sort of texture to them. But the bracts are diagnostic for ponderosa. But now, again, we don't have any more Lucy's warblers at all. There could still be some black-throated gray warblers up here, but now we get Grace's warbler. Now we're getting a little bit more colorful. They like it up in the cool mountain forest. Likewise, we have whiskered screech owl up here, which looks a lot like a western screech owl when you look at the bird. The easy way to tell them, two easy ways. Number one is their voice. They sound different. And that's probably how they recognize each other out in the woods at night. But also, the whiskered screech owl has a pale bill, kind of like almost like a bluish green bill, whereas the western screech owl has a black bill. So that's an easy way to tell them apart. If that problem ever comes up in your life, now you're ready to answer that. So we don't have any more desert spiny lizards. We don't have any more Clark spiny lizards, which are sort of intermediate between the desert spiny and this guy. The yarrow spiny lizard is the high elevation spiny lizard. And in the mornings, even in the middle of summer, it can be relatively cool up in the mountains. So if you get up real early, sun's just coming up, these lizards will look all black. And that's so they can warm up and go about their day. Once they do warm up, they're beautiful, blue, green, yellow. They're very fantastic lizards. But if you took this guy and put him down in the desert, they would not do well because it's way too hot for them down there. Ackman blue, again, sticking with the blue butterflies. This is a higher elevation species oftentimes. It can go down. This was on rabbit brush. It does occasionally come down. This was in like November, so possibly some sort of displacement because of the cooler weather up top brought it down low. And then you get to the top of the mountains, and this is Barfoot Park and the Chiricahuas, and this is an area that they might get feet of snow every winter, and it's not a whole lot of deciduous trees. There's one notable exception to that, but this is the land mostly of conifers. So you get up there, this is the one sort of exception to the rule. Lots of quaking aspen up at this elevation, but these again are deciduous. Quaking aspen are really cool trees. You look at this photo and there's a whole bunch of trunks, and this could potentially be all one plant because quaking aspens grow by sort of almost like runners, like Bermuda grass does. And so I don't know, I can't say this definitively, but that could be the case with this plant. Here's what the leaves look like. Quaking aspen and cottonwoods, they're in the same genus together. So their leaves look quite similar. They usually have the white bark. White firs are up here as well. Firs are very cold tolerant trees, so they do very well up in the mountains, at the tops of the mountains. These higher elevation species are the things that I think are potentially most at risk of climate change because they're already at the tops of the mountains. They don't have anywhere else they can really go. So there's a fair amount of concern for animals and plants that live up on the mountaintops. Here's again their individual needles. Here's their cone. Their cones are sort of resinous and they don't open for quite some time, and they often grow upright. You can see where the resin is kind of oozed out in places. But this is the land of the red-faced warbler, and this is one of those birds. If you've not seen one, you should try to see one because they're really beautiful birds to look at. And the good thing is they're not really rare. They're actually fairly common if you get in the right habitat. And again, they're tops of the mountains usually. Another type of blue is up here, the Echo Azure. And so these are at going to damp soil, kind of what we call a puddle party. And they're getting salts that were dissolved by water. And if you go far enough north, you get elk. And these are largest deer in Arizona, and very magnificent animals. Or you could go up to the Colorado Plateau and you can find them all over the place. So that was the Sky Islands in a rocket ship because we went through them pretty quick. And so one of the learning objectives for this presentation is what is a naturalist? And Webster defines it as a student of natural history. And I mean, that's true. I think that is accurate. However, in my mind, being a student of natural history should encompass more things. First of all, and let me just say here, it doesn't matter what group of organisms you're interested in. There is an infinite amount to learn about every group. So just get out there and be observant and take notes and take photos and use iNaturalist and all those sorts of things. And I think, since all of you are taking this class, I think you already have most of these categories. I mean, you're passionate about the natural world. The natural world is under threat in all directions. And it's also super cool. And one of the things I like the most about doing what I do is sharing how cool the natural world is with others, because there's a vast amount of misinformation out there. people are either uninformed or misinformed, and a lot of that sort of stuff can be detrimental to the natural world. So getting out there and talking to people and educating them is a very good thing, and it's rewarding for them, and it's rewarding for you too, because you can, I always feel good when I've taught somebody a new thing. Thirst for knowledge, I think, is important, meaning you'll never learn it all. Nobody on earth has ever learned it all. But take your whatever group you're interested in. If you're interested in the holistic approach, kind of like I am, just take that road as far as it will take you, and you'll never have a bad day out there, in my opinion. Like I said, you want to share what you're doing, and you also want to enjoy. Let's face it, some days you're out there and you're like, man, it's hot. This group in front of me are kind of unruly. What am I doing? Well, they're going to be able to pick up on that really fast. I mean, we are really good at reading body language and tone and that sort of thing. But if you go out there and you're excited, you might have a cold, your allergies may be kicking in. But if you go out there and you're just, this is a mesquite tree, this is the coolest tree ever, pretty soon your enthusiasm will be contagious and you will enjoy it even more. And always remember, if you're out there with a group, regardless of where you are, and you see a cactus wren, don't fall into the trap and say, oh, that's just a cactus wren. Well, because first of all, it's the product of millions of years of evolution and just should not be used to describe it. On the second hand, the people in your group may never have seen a cactus wren in their entire life, and this is the first time they're seeing it. And if you go in and you say, oh, that's just a cactus wren, well, they're going to say, well, that thing's not that important. Why should I care about it? Because of what you said about it. Don't say, oh, that's just a mesquite tree, or that's just whatever. And it's going to happen sooner or later. It will crop in, but try not to do that, because you're belittling whatever it is you're talking about, and we shouldn't be belittling anything out there. So, be passionate, be thirsty for knowledge, share it with others, and just enjoy the hell out of it while you're doing it, and you'll never have a bad day. Well, probably won't have many bad days. So this is kind of a fun thing I saw on the internet that I think pretty much fits the thing. I think at some level, we might think we're David Attenborough. We know those dulcet tones, and we're explaining the world to everybody. What my mother thinks I'm wrangling rattlesnakes out there. We're not Bear Grylls trying to challenge ourselves by surviving on pine needles for 6 weeks. We're certainly not running around naked, although naturalist and naturist are two very similar words. And, if you say, well, what do you do? I'm a naturalist, and someone raises their eyebrows, it's like, no, I'm into nature, not the other. And then this is what you really do. You're looking at stuff and you're like, that's not hard. That's really cool. I learned something today. So we today are on the shoulders of those of us who came before us. And all of the knowledge that we've been able to acquire has been acquired by others. And we're just now able to incorporate. Now we're learning things that they never knew, but we're also taking what they taught us and are using it when we're talking to others. And these are 6 gentlemen who are pillars in the early, mostly in the 1800s, middle to late 1800s, of natural history study in North America. And hopefully by now, you've realized one thing about them. They all have really cool beards. No, that's not it. They're all white men. And I don't want to be the guy who blasts white men, because I'm one myself. But in my view, when we're out there trying to save the natural world, anybody who is willing to help do that is an ally, regardless of anything else. And so we've started to see this kind of coming out of the pandemic. We started to see a lot of organizations strive for diversity and inclusivity, and that's fantastic. In my view, we're stronger the more diverse we are. And bringing different attitudes, bringing different ideas to the table is not a bad thing. I think that's a very good thing. So there are a lot of really fascinating naturalists out there over the years. Sarah Plumer Lemon is one of them. A couple of years ago, a biography of her about her came out, The Forgotten Botanist by Wynne Brown. It's a fantastic book. Well, she grew up in Maine, and then she had health issues. Then she moved to California, and not only was she sort of a humanitarian, she first created one of the first public libraries in California, but she was also a determined botanist and a fantastic artist. And she was living at a time when it was sort of frowned upon for women to go out in the field because that wasn't a ladylike thing to do. And she said, well, screw that. I really like plants and I'm going to go look at them. And none of you guys are going to tell me otherwise. And I'm like, right on, Sarah, you do it. So if you want to read her biography, it's a fantastic book. It uses a lot of her letters that she wrote to various people, but Mount Lemmon is named for her. So that's here, especially here in Tucson, that's kind of a cool thing. Margaret Morse Nice was a ornithologist and child psychologist and ethologist. She was covering all of her bases. Look at that typewriter. That thing, man, that thing probably weighed about 90 pounds. But she did a study on a bird that's very common called the song sparrow. And she published her findings in the late 1930s. And it was a model for a single species study in how broad it was in its scope. And she was one of the first women admitted to the American Ornithologist Union. It's now called the American Ornithological Society. And it wasn't because she was a woman, it's because, in spite of her being a woman, it's because her work was so good and so well respected by her peers that that's like, this is Margaret knows what's going on, we should welcome her into the club. And they did. So that's a cool thing. Lauren Esposito out at the California Academy of Sciences. She's been on some podcasts. She's actually a scorpion biologist, and who doesn't like scorpion biology? I mean, they're pretty, it's a small group, but they're really cool people. But so she's been not only active in science, she's at the California Academy of Sciences, but she's also done a lot of work for the LGBT that group, the diversity group. I can't even say the initials, but she's very active in that, promoting science and science education to people that have been largely excluded. And that is probably arguably more important than what she's doing with the scorpions. And so hats off to her. Eliana Fierro Calderon is a Colombian biologist who is now the International Project Officer for the American Bird Conservancy. She's done a lot of field work, not only in Colombia, but also in Ecuador, Indonesia, Malaysia, and in Arizona, up in Coconino County. She worked for a while at the University of Montana in Tom Brown's lab, and now she's been able to take that her knowledge of birds, but also what she's learned as far as field techniques and things of that nature, to become a project officer for one of the leading bird conservation organizations in the world. So that's very cool. And if you ever get a chance to go to Colombia, go, because it's a wonderful country. This Robin Wall Kimmerer, she's a Native American. She's in the Potawatomi tribe. She's got a PhD in ethnobotany from the University of Wisconsin. You may have read her books, Braiding Sweetgrass and Gathering Moss. She's a pioneer in Native Americans being in the scientific community. She's also been on a bunch of podcasts, so you can listen to her if you search around for them. Priya Najapi works for the National Parks Conservation Society. She's one of their heads in conservation. And she's also a herpetologist. So first of all, I love that she's holding a snake, because there's a lot of people who don't like to hold snakes. And she's also doing great work for another major conservation organization, the National Parks Conservation Association, the NPCA. Nicole Jackson is a one of the instructors for the Cornell University Bird Academy. She's also started like a Black Birders group because she's one of those that, you know, not a lot of, when I lead birding trips, whether it's for the county or my own or whatever, it's frustrating at some level because most of the people on it look like me. 95% of the people on these bird walks look like me. And that's fine, but it would be really great to get other people involved. And, you know, so I think what's part of the reason why some of these groups have been formed is that very reason. It's like when I go on bird walks, you know, if you're Nicole, if you go on a bird walk, there might not be anybody who looks like you. And that might make you feel uncomfortable, perhaps. But if you form your own group, then you can feel part of a bigger endeavor, and you'll feel comfortable while doing it. So that's again, that's kind of come out of the pandemic. The pandemic was largely pretty awful, but there were some pluses, and I think that, you know, the desire for more and more organizations to become more exclusive and diverse, I think that's partly what came out of it. But also the springing up of these other groups, was like the feminist birders, and, you know, if you're interested in just about anything, there's probably a little subgroup of that community that is tailored for a specific set of participants that aren't well represented in other endeavors for that same organization. Virginia Rose, I have had the pleasure to meet her, talk to her a few times. She started an organization called Birdability. She, as a teenager, she grew up in Austin, Texas, and she got thrown from a horse and became paraplegic, and now she's confined to a wheelchair. So she started Birdability to sort of get people like her out in the field, and she's expanded it to include, you know, people who are blind or people who are deaf, you know, basically no condition or disability people should be excluded from loving nature. In her case, particularly birds. In fact, she's got a shirt from the Tucson Audubon Festival a few years ago on in this picture. But, you know, so now she goes around to these different organizations and says, well, you know, we have these site evaluation reports. Anybody can fill out. You can just download them off of their website, and you can go to like a neighborhood park, and you can bring your tape measure, and there's all kinds of things involved. Like, is there a wheelchair ramp in the parking lot? Is the parking lot paved, or is it gravel or dirt? Because gravel is going to be harder to negotiate a chair through. Are there wheelchair accessible restrooms? Where, if you have these gazebos that look out on a wetland, where are the bars to keep people from falling in the water? Because they could be right at the height of someone sitting in a wheelchair. So again, nature study is open to anybody who has an interest in it. Robert Mesta, he retired from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He's a Native American. And now he's working for a feather repository. And it's one of two sites where Native Americans, for their ceremonies, can get like eagle feathers legally, and it doesn't cost them anything. So, you know, he's learned a lot in his career with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and now is giving back to his own community. And that's fantastic. So I think that's the last slide. Oh, I forgot about Jonathan. There's a couple more. Jonathan Hall's been doing research on California condors. He's at Eastern Michigan University. He's also pursuing a degree in veterinary medicine. J. Drew Lanham, he's at Clemson University, and he wrote this book a couple of years ago. The subtitle is Memoirs of a Colored Man's Love love about nature. And so he is also one of the leading lights when it comes to inclusivity. And again, like I said, you know, you don't have to have anybody who's interested in nature. The only requirement should be the passion and the interest in not only learning nature, but hopefully sharing that with others. Because if you don't share it, you can make the argument that the knowledge isn't really all that great because you're keeping it inside. Knowledge is meant to be shared, right? Now, when I was in high school and college and I was taking physics, I was kind of like, well, you can hold on to that. I don't really want to know that. I don't want you to share with me that stuff. But for doing what you're going to embark on, you want to share. That's one of the reasons probably why you're in this program is you want to learn things and then be able to share them with the public. And that should be the only requirement. Nothing else should matter, in my opinion. So let's see, did I give any time? Oh, 10 minutes. I got done. I felt like a sprint. Sorry if I was talking really fast, but I wanted to leave time for questions. So
That was awesome. Thank you so much, Jeff. That was really cool.
you're welcome. Happy to do it.
One question from Sean was, what criteria did they use to differentiate the different ecosystems? I understand that the change is a gradient, but just wondering what factors are included when deciding.
That's a great question, Sean. There's a lot of things that go into it, and the gradient is part of it. There's also things like temperature, precipitation, soil chemistry that can have a big impact on what plants are growing in what areas. Some like limestone soils, other like sandy soil, and so there's a lot that goes into it, and different scientists may be focusing on different aspects of that for their own purposes. And that's why you end up with multiple sort of definitions of this, because different researchers are looking at maybe slightly different things, and you end up with slightly different names or different borders and that sort of thing. But basically, the key living thing they're looking at are the plants, because the plants kind of define the community. But what grows where is dependent on a lot of other things, like the gradient, the aspect, soil chemistry, temperature, both summer, winter, rainfall, when the rains come, all that sort of thing. So, but it's basically plant community based. So that's why you'll never see, well, we were up in the Gila woodpecker zone because that, I mean, it's not formally been named, but if you're in the Gila woodpecker zone, everybody kind of understands you're either in a riparian forest with cottonwoods or you're in the saguaro forest.
Awesome. Thank you. From Anne, when is the best time to visit the Sky Islands?
I think any time is good. So this time of year, depending on where I was just in Wilcox for the Wings Over Wilcox Festival this past weekend. The Chiricahuas, the Peñalenos, where Mount Graham is, there was a lot of snow up there. So this time of year, it's a little bit quiet, but I would say anytime from spring, say March through until like November. If you go up in the fall, you get to see the aspens and the big tooth maples change color. It's pretty spectacular, but certainly, anytime in that stretch. And it's a great place to go when it gets hot, because don't go on the weekends because everybody else will be up there too. But if you're able to go during a weekday, you can get out of the heat a little bit and get into some really cool plants and animals up there. But probably the least visited in the winter months, and then most visited during the summer. But it's great anytime you wanted to go up there. And just bear in mind, some places you may not be able to get to the tops of the mountains because like the Forest Service will close gates or something like that. And at least you can't get to them by vehicle, but they're open 24/7, 365 days a year.
Excellent. From Amir, he asks, I've read about cactus flowers that bloom at night, and I was wondering what was the purpose of this? Also, what are some of your favorite birds to see in Arizona?
Oh, that's going to take a while. So we'll answer so there are some species that of cacti and other plants as well, but cacti, for this purposes of this answer, they have evolved to open in the evening. And those plants tend to be pollinated by one of two groups, or maybe both, bats and moths. And they tend to have very similar characteristics, being pale in color. So white or cream or maybe a very pale yellow. They tend to be out near the edges of the plant instead of in the middle because they don't want the pollinator to have to navigate through a bunch of branches and stuff to get to the flower. And they also tend to be highly fragrant. So those are like syndromes, they're called, that are characteristics of flowers that are pollinated by those animals. Why they evolve to pollinate or to open in the evening is a more complex question to answer. It could be a situation where early on in their distant past, maybe there was one plant or maybe a couple plants that had this mutation where they would open at a different time than they normally would. So opening in the evening instead of during the daytime, and just by maybe luck that those flowers were pollinated more effectively than the ones that were open during the daytime. And then tens of hundreds of millions of years later, they flower at night because that's when they're best pollinated. Because plants obviously can't move around anywhere. So they're kind of stuck where they are. And so they have to come up with a way to attract their pollinators to them. And just by the vagaries of evolution, some of them might be more effectively pollinated at night by their pollinator, which again are mostly going to be bats and moths. And then that mutation ended up spreading throughout the population because it was so successful. And then pretty soon they're all flowering at night. And that's a guess as to how that evolved. The best, see, I could answer the best bird question or favorite bird question, and then I'll give an answer and I'll say like 2 minutes later, oh no, never mind. I like this other one. I think they're all fantastic, every single one of them. Maybe something like a red-faced warbler. That's a pretty cool bird to see. Golden eagles, they're not very colorful, but they're such majestic birds. I love owls. Any day you see an owl is a good day. So that's a hard one. Maybe the last bird I saw, which today I think was a mourning dove, which is, that's kind of everybody says my favorite bird's a mourning dove. Then, they're like, wow, really? Of all the birds out there, that's the one you settled on? But they're all great, every one of them.
Awesome. Any other questions from anybody?
I've glazed all their eyes over.
Perfectly. All right. Well, Jeff, thank you again so very much for all your time and your words of wisdom, and definitely enjoyable.
Thank you very much, Dave. Thank you for having me. And again, thank you all for taking this journey you're going to be on. And I really look forward to meeting you in person someday. I think that would be a lot of fun. So if ever I'm up in the Phoenix area, or if you're down here in Tucson, we should make a plan to get together. But I wish you all the best on your journey. Enjoy it. It's going to be a lot of fun. And I hope to talk to you again.
Jeff,
Excellent.
would you mind sharing your email in the chat? Would that
Sure.
be okay?
Of course.
Would you just drop it in for everyone? Because I'm sure there are a lot of questions that'll be evolving from our discussions afterwards.
Yeah. Don't hesitate to send me an email about anything. I don't know. I may not be able to answer it, but I will do my best. And if I don't know the answer, I will just make something up, and then you can go
we'll
along
never
from
know.
that point. Yeah, that's right. Well, no, I will. I'm just kidding. I will obviously give you the best answer that I possibly can. Or if I don't know the answer, I might be able to give you resources or people to talk to who could give you an answer for that question.
Thank you so very much.
My pleasure. Thank you, everybody.
Want to reiterate one of the people that he mentioned as a naturalist, Robin Wall Kimmerer. If you have not read Braiding Sweetgrass, I highly recommend it. This is one impressive book. I learned more about swamps than I ever thought possible, and now I want to go visit one with her. This lady is amazing.
She's pretty remarkable. In New York,
so yeah.
Well, I don't know. I'm just thinking, New York in the winter, Maricopa County in the winter. There might be an avenue there to get her to come out. I'm not sure, but there might be. I see an opening.
Checking out. Okay.
Exactly right.
Thank you so very much.
My pleasure. Take care, everyone. Good luck.
And I think everybody can now see why Jeff is one of our popular ways to open your training, an introduction to what Arizona is all about, as well as what a naturalist is all about. So
Well, I
thank
hope
you.
I didn't scare anybody off. I didn't know this was the opening kickoff. I would have, now that was, I'm glad you told me now, because that was some pressure I didn't need to start with. But no, it's great. It's a great organization. You're going to have a lot of fun. You're going to be outside. You're going to have some really cool, meet other cool people in the organization. Just enjoy the ride. It'll be a great time.
It will be. And one last question from Ann, I just saw flashed up. The name of your company, please share it with everyone.
Sky Island Tours. I can type. It's actually in the email. I put in there Jeff at Sky Island Tours. I do birding tours a lot, especially this time of year. But I also do butterfly tours, dragonfly tours, general natural history tours, and I do a lot of the same stuff for Pima County Natural Resources. So if you're down in the Tucson area for a few days, you can go to our website and look us up. Maybe we can spend some time in the field together. That'd be great.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
So just a reminder to everyone, if you've not yet signed up for the Field Lab #1 on Saturday, but you plan to attend, please get your name onto the list. It's in the Field Lab module. And if you, as I said, if some of you missed it at the beginning, if you discover plans have changed, you weren't able to come earlier, but suddenly Saturday morning you are, please come and join us. It's going to be kind of a potpourri, a tasting of some of the things we're going to be doing, led by some master naturalists who have been trained in this group and are in training, who just have expertise in some of the things that you'll be doing. So see you at CNU, Center for Native and Urban Wildlife, in the middle of Scottsdale Community College campus. And I think that ends our announcements for tonight. So we're going to divide up into your mentor